I still remembered the sound of laughter that night. Not the warm kind that wrapped around you like a favorite sweater, but the sharp cutting kind that left marks you could not see. 11 years had passed since that evening at the Sterling Oak restaurant in Phoenix. Yet I could still recall every detail with the clarity of yesterday. The white tablecloths, the crystal glasses catching candlelight, the way my cousin Victoria looked at me when she said those words that changed everything. I was 18 then, fresh out of high school, and still naive enough to believe that family meant something. My sister Bethany had just announced her engagement to a man named Trevor, and our extended family decided to celebrate at one of the nicest restaurants in the city. I had arrived early, excited to be part of something special. Bethany was 5 years older than me, and we had never been particularly close. But she was still my sister. I wanted to support her. The private dining room was already filling up when I walked in. Aunts and uncles I barely recognized mingled with people I had never seen before. My mother spotted me from across the room and waved, but she was deep in conversation with Trevor's parents. I made my way toward the long table that dominated the center of the space, looking for a place to sit. That was when Victoria intercepted me. She was 26 at the time, the daughter of my mother's older brother, and she had always treated me like I was invisible, or worse, like I was an inconvenience. She stood between me and the table, her expression a mixture of amusement and disdain. "Where do you think you're going?" She asked loud enough that several people nearby turned to look. "To sit down," I said, confused. "Is there assigned seating?" Victoria laughed, and it sounded like breaking glass. "This table is for family," she said, gesturing at the empty chairs behind her. "Go find a spot outside." I stared at her, certain I had misheard. "What are you talking about? I am family." "Not really," she said, her smile widening. "You know what I mean? Real family, the people who matter." The words hit me like a physical blow. Around us, conversations continued, but I could feel eyes on me. Some people pretended not to hear. Others watched with uncomfortable interest, waiting to see what I would do. My face burned with humiliation, but I could not seem to move. I opened my mouth to respond, but nothing came out. Trevor appeared beside Victoria, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Everything okay here?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Just explaining the seating arrangements," Victoria said sweetly. Andrea was a bit confused. Trevor looked at me, and I saw something in his expression that I could not quite identify. Not sympathy, not quite cruelty either, more like indifference, as if I was a problem he did not want to deal with. "Maybe it would be better if you sat somewhere else," he said. "This is supposed to be a special night for Bethany. We do not want any drama." The implication was clear. If there was drama, it would be my fault for causing it, not Victoria's for creating the situation in the first place. I felt something crack inside me, something that had been fragile to begin with. I looked past them to the table where Bethany sat talking with her future mother-in-law. She had heard everything. I knew she had. But she did not turn around. She did not defend me. She just kept talking as if I did not exist. I left the restaurant that night without saying another word. I did not cry until I reached my car, parked 3 blocks away because I had arrived too early to get a spot in the lot. I sat behind the wheel and let the tears come, hot and angry and full of something I could not name. Shame, rage, grief for something I had never really had but had always wanted to believe in. After that night, things changed. I stopped going to family events. When my mother asked why, I gave vague excuses about work or school. She never pushed. And I realized she probably knew exactly why I was staying away. She had been in that room. She had heard Victoria. She had seen Bethany turn her back, and she had done nothing. I threw myself into my studies instead. I had always been good with numbers, and I found comfort in the predictability of mathematics. Variables could be solved, equations balanced. There was a right answer, and if you worked hard enough, you could find it. My professors noticed my dedication, and when I graduated with my degree in finance, I was offered a position at a small investment firm in Phoenix. It was entry-level work, but I did not care. I had a plan. Over the next 11 years, I built something from nothing. I worked longer hours than anyone else in the office. I took on projects that others avoided. I learned everything I could about portfolio management, risk assessment, and market analysis. I was good at it. Better than good. I had a talent for seeing patterns that others missed, for anticipating shifts in the market before they happened. By the time I was 25, I had been promoted twice. At 27, I left the firm to start my own financial consulting business. It was a risk, but I had saved every penny I could. and I had built a network of clients who trusted my judgment. The first year was brutal. I worked from a tiny office that was barely larger than a closet, and there were nights when I survived on instant ramen and coffee because I had poured everything into the business. But it worked slowly at first, then faster than I had dared to hope. My reputation grew. I specialized in helping small businesses optimize their investments, and word spread that I was someone who could be trusted, someone who delivered results. By the time I turned 29, my company employed 15 people, and I was managing portfolios worth millions of dollars. I rarely thought about that night at Sterling Oak anymore, or at least I told myself I did not. The truth was more complicated. The memory lived in the back of my mind like a scar that itched when the weather changed. I had built a successful life, but there was a part of me that remained trapped in that moment, standing in front of Victoria while she laughed at me. I'd proven that I was worth something, but only to myself. The people who had dismissed me 11 years ago had no idea what I had become. My mother called occasionally, always with the same forced cheerfulness in her voice. She told me about family gatherings I had not been invited to. She mentioned that Bethany and Trevor had moved into a new house in Scottsdale. She never asked why I stayed away, and I never volunteered an explanation. It was easier for both of us to pretend that everything was fine. Then 3 months ago, the phone call came. My mother's voice was different this time. Nervous, almost apologetic. "Bethany wants you to come to her wedding," she said without preamble. I was silent for a long moment. "Her wedding?" I repeated to Trevor. "Yes." My mother hesitated. "She is getting married again." The first one did not work out. The information landed with an unexpected weight. Bethany and Trevor had divorced. When? Why? My mother did not offer details, and I did not ask. "Why does she want me there?" I said instead. "Because you are her sister," my mother said, and there was a pleading note in her voice that I had never heard before. "She knows things have been difficult between you, but she wants to try to fix that. She wants you to be part of her special day." I wanted to laugh. After 11 years of silence, Bethany suddenly wanted me at her wedding. It was absurd. But even as I thought it, something else stirred inside me. Curiosity, maybe, or the faint echo of that 18-year-old girl who had wanted so badly to belong. "I will think about it," I said. My mother sighed with relief. "Thank you, Andrea. That is all I ask." After we hung up, I sat in my office and stared out the window at the Phoenix skyline. The sun was setting, painting the buildings in shades of gold and amber. I had built this life on my own terms. I did not need Bethy's approval or Victoria's validation. I did not need any of them. But I wanted something. I wanted them to see what I had become. I wanted them to understand that the girl they had dismissed was gone, replaced by someone who had turned her humiliation into fuel. Someone who had succeeded in spite of them, not because of them. I called my mother back the next day. "Tell Bethany I will be there," I said. The wedding was scheduled for late October at a boutique hotel in downtown Phoenix. According to my mother, Bethany was marrying a man named Julian, someone she had met through work. He was supposedly successful, charming, and completely different from Trevor. I listened to the details with half an ear, already planning what I would wear, what I would say, how I would present myself. I wanted them to remember me as that awkward 18-year-old. I wanted them to see how wrong they had been. But more than that, I wanted to walk into that wedding with my head held high, knowing that I had earned every ounce of respect I commanded. Not because of my family, not because of their approval, but because I had built something real, something lasting, something that could not be taken away by cruel words or indifferent silence. The weeks leading up to the wedding passed in a blur of work and preparation. I found the perfect dress, a deep navy sheath that was elegant without being flashy. I rehearsed conversations in my head, imagining what I would say if Victoria approached me, if Bethany tried to apologize, if anyone asked what I had been doing for the past 11 years. I told myself I was going to prove a point, but deep down I knew the truth. I was going back because I needed to see their faces when they realized who I had become. I needed that closure, that validation, even if it made me petty, even if it meant I was still letting that night define me in some small way. The invitation arrived 2 weeks before the wedding. It was cream-colored with gold lettering, expensive and tasteful. Bethany and Julian cordially invite you to celebrate their union. The words were printed in an elegant script, and tucked inside was a handwritten note from Bethany herself. "Andrea, I know we have not spoken in a long time. I hope you can forgive me for that. I want you to be there. It would mean everything to me. Love, Bethany." I read the note 3 times, searching for hidden meaning. Was she sincere? Did she actually regret what had happened? Or was this just a performance, a way to assuage her own guilt? I could not tell, but I folded the note carefully and placed it in my desk drawer. Whether or not Bethany was genuine, I was still going. I had made that decision, and I intended to see it through. The night before the wedding, I could not sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling of my apartment, my mind racing with memories I had tried to bury. I thought about that 18-year-old girl, so eager to belong that she had walked into a room full of people who did not want her there. I thought about how small I had felt when Victoria dismissed me, and how much smaller I had felt when Bethany refused to acknowledge me. But I also thought about everything that had come after. The late nights studying, the early mornings working, the risks I had taken, and the victories I had earned. I had built a life that mattered, not just to me, but to the people who depended on me. My clients trusted me with their futures. My employees looked to me for leadership. I was not that frightened girl anymore. I was someone who had transformed pain into purpose. When I finally drifted off to sleep, I dreamed of standing in the Sterling Oak restaurant again. But this time, when Victoria told me to leave, I did not cry. I smiled instead. And when I turned to walk away, the entire room stood up and followed me out the door. I woke up before dawn, feeling strangely calm. Today was the day. Today, I would walk into my sister's wedding and confront the past I'd been running from for 11 years. I showered and dressed carefully, taking my time with my hair and makeup. When I looked in the mirror, I barely recognized the woman staring back at me. She was polished and confident with an air of quiet authority that came from years of hard-won experience. The wedding was scheduled for 3:00 p.m., and I arrived at the hotel exactly on time. The lobby was decorated with white flowers and soft lighting, and a sign directed guests toward the rooftop terrace where the ceremony would take place. I took the elevator up, my heart pounding despite my outward calm. The terrace was beautiful, string lights hung overhead, and rows of white chairs faced a floral arch overlooking the city skyline. Guests were already seated, chatting in low voices as they waited for the ceremony to begin. I scanned the crowd, recognizing faces I had not seen in over a decade. My aunts and uncles, distant cousins, and there, near the front, was Victoria. She looked older, of course. Her hair was shorter, and there were faint lines around her eyes. She wore a pale pink dress and was talking animatedly with someone I did not recognize. I watched her for a moment, feeling a strange detachment. This was the woman who had humiliated me. This was the person whose words had haunted me for years. But standing there now, I realized she held no power over me anymore. She was just a person, flawed and ordinary. I found a seat toward the back, not wanting to draw attention. A few people glanced at me, their expressions politely curious, but no one seemed to recognize me. I suppose that was not surprising. I had changed a lot in 11 years. The awkward teenager with uncertain posture and ill-fitting clothes was gone, replaced by a woman who carried herself with purpose. Music began to play, and the guests fell silent. The groom appeared first, walking down the aisle with his groomsmen. Julian was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair and an easy smile. He looked nervous, the way grooms always do, but there was genuine happiness in his eyes. I felt a pang of something unexpected. Not jealousy exactly, just a wistfulness for the kind of certainty he seemed to have about his future. Then Bethany appeared at the entrance to the terrace, and the guests rose to their feet. She was beautiful in a simple white gown, her hair swept up in an elegant twist. She held a bouquet of white roses and smiled as she walked down the aisle toward Julian. For a moment, I saw her as she had been 11 years ago, younger and perhaps less aware of the cruelty she had allowed to happen. But mostly, I saw a stranger, someone I had spent years trying to forget. The ceremony was brief and traditional. They exchanged vows and rings, and when the officiant pronounced them married, the guests erupted in applause. Bethany and Julian kissed, then turned to walk back down the aisle together. As they passed my row, Bethy's eyes swept over the crowd. For just a second, her gaze landed on me. Recognition flickered across her face, followed by something I could not quite read: surprise, guilt, relief. Then she was past me, smiling at other guests, and the moment was gone. The reception was held in a ballroom on the floor below. Tables were arranged around a central dance floor, each one adorned with candles and fresh flowers. A string quartet played softly in one corner, while waitstaff circulated with trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. I accepted a glass of champagne and made my way toward the seating chart displayed near the entrance. I found my name at a table near the back, far from the head table where Bethany and Julian would sit. I was not surprised. Even now, I was still being kept at a distance. But I did not let it bother me. I had not come here expecting to be welcomed with open arms. I had come to prove something, and I intended to see it through. I made my way to my assigned table and found it occupied by people I did not recognize. A middle-aged couple who introduced themselves as friends of Julian's parents, a younger woman who worked with Bethany at some marketing firm. They were polite but distant, clearly wondering who I was and why I was sitting with them instead of closer to the family tables. I made small talk, answering their questions vaguely. Yes, I was related to the bride. No, I did not see her often. We had been out of touch for a while. They nodded and moved on to other topics, and I was grateful for their lack of curiosity. I sipped my champagne and watched the room fill up with guests, scanning faces for familiar ones. Victoria arrived with a man I assumed was her husband. She looked even more polished up close, her dress clearly expensive, her jewelry understated but elegant. She did not notice me at first, too busy greeting people and laughing at jokes I could not hear from across the room. I felt a flicker of the old anger, but I pushed it down. Tonight was not about Victoria. It was about me and what I had become despite her. Dinner was served shortly after everyone was seated. The food was excellent, far better than I had expected. Grilled salmon with herb butter, roasted vegetables, a delicate salad with vinaigrette that tasted like summer. I ate slowly, listening to the conversations around me and watching the head table where Bethany and Julian sat with their immediate families. My mother was there, seated beside my stepfather. She looked nervous, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for something or someone. I wondered if she had told Bethany that I had accepted the invitation. I wondered if my sister had been expecting me to actually show up, or if she thought I would change my mind at the last minute. After dinner, the toast began. Julian's best man stood and delivered a speech full of inside jokes and heartfelt sentiments. Bethy's maid of honor followed, talking about how happy she was to see her friend find love again after a difficult divorce. The word hung in the air like an elephant everyone was trying to ignore. Divorce, failure, a first marriage that had not worked out. I thought about Trevor, the man Bethany had been engaged to 11 years ago. The man who had stood beside Victoria that night and told me to sit somewhere else. What had happened between them? Why had their marriage fallen apart? My mother had never given me details, and I had never asked. But sitting there now, listening to toasts about second chances and new beginnings, I found myself curious. When the speeches ended, the music shifted from classical to something more upbeat. Julian led Bethany onto the dance floor for their first dance as a married couple. They moved together easily, smiling at each other with an intimacy that made the watching crowd fade into the background. It was a sweet moment, and I felt a reluctant warmth toward my sister. Whatever had happened in the past, she deserved happiness. Everyone did. But then the song ended, and the DJ invited other guests to join them on the floor. The room erupted into motion as people stood and made their way toward the center of the ballroom. I stayed in my seat, content to watch from the sidelines. I had never been much of a dancer, and I had no desire to insert myself into the celebration in a way that would draw attention. That was when Julian appeared at my table. He wore a broad smile and held out his hand. "You must be Andrea," he said, his voice warm and friendly. "Bethany pointed you out earlier. Would you like to dance?" I hesitated, surprised by the gesture. "I do not want to take you away from your guests," I said. "Nonsense," he said. "You are family. Come on." I let him lead me onto the dance floor, acutely aware of the eyes following us. Julian was an excellent dancer, guiding me through the steps with an ease that made me look better than I actually was. He chatted as we moved, asking about my life and what I did for work. I answered honestly, telling him about my financial consulting business. His eyes lit up with interest. "That is impressive," he said. "Bethany mentioned you were smart, but she did not say you were running your own company." I felt a small thrill at the words. Bethany had talked about me. She had called me smart. Maybe she did remember me as more than just the awkward teenager she had ignored. "It has been a lot of work," I said, "but I love what I do." "I can tell," Julian said. "You have that look, the one people get when they are talking about something they are passionate about." Before I could respond, someone tapped Julian on the shoulder. I turned to see Victoria standing there, her smile bright but her eyes cold. "Mind if I cut in?" she said, though it was not really a question. Julian glanced at me, and I nodded. "Of course," I said. "Thank you for the dance." He squeezed my hand briefly before stepping away, leaving me alone with Victoria. She looked me up and down, her expression unreadable. "Andrea," she said, as if testing the name on her tongue. I almost did not recognize you." "It has been a long time," I said evenly. 11 years, she said, and there was something sharp in her tone. "You have been avoiding us." "I have been busy," I said, refusing to let her bait me. Victoria laughed, that same cutting sound I remembered from the sterling oak. "Busy, right? Well, you look good, different, more polished." "Thank you," I said, though the compliment felt like an insult. She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice so that only I could hear. "You know, I always wondered what happened to you. After that night, I thought maybe you would come crawling back eventually, begging for forgiveness." Her words were designed to wound, and they succeeded. I felt the familiar heat of anger rising in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. "I had nothing to apologize for," I said quietly. Victoria shrugged. "That is not how I remember it. You made a scene. You embarrassed Bethany on what was supposed to be a special night." Trevor was furious. The revisionist history was breathtaking. In her version of events, I was the villain. I was the one who had caused problems. Not her, not Trevor. Not Bethany, who had sat silently while I was humiliated. I wanted to scream at her, to tell her exactly what I thought of her twisted version of reality. But I did not, because I knew that was what she wanted. She wanted me to lose control, to prove that I was still that frightened teenager who could be pushed around. Instead, I smiled. "It is interesting how people remember things differently," I said. "But I suppose it does not matter anymore." That was a long time ago. Victoria's smile faltered for just a second, and I saw confusion flicker across her face. She had expected me to fight back, to defend myself. My calm response had thrown her off balance. "Well," she said, recovering quickly, "I'm glad you could make it tonight. Bethany will be happy to see you." "I hope so," I said, and turned to walk away before she could say anything else. I made my way back to my table, my hands trembling slightly from the adrenaline coursing through my veins. I had faced Victoria. I had not let her rattle me. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. I sat down and drained the rest of my champagne, letting the bubbles settle my nerves. The reception continued around me, a blur of music and laughter and clinking glasses. I watched people dance and mingle, feeling oddly separate from it all. I had come here to prove something, but I was beginning to realize that the people I wanted to prove it to were not capable of seeing me clearly. Victoria would always see me as that awkward teenager. My mother would always see me as the daughter who had caused trouble by refusing to play along. And Bethany, I was not sure what Bethany saw when she looked at me. But then something unexpected happened. Julian returned to the head table, and I saw him lean down to whisper something in Bethy's ear. She looked up startled, and her eyes found mine across the room. She said something back to him, and he nodded, glancing in my direction. They were talking about me. I could feel it. A few minutes later, Julian stood and made his way through the crowd toward my table. My heart started to race. What was he doing? Had I done something wrong? But when he reached me, his expression was friendly, almost conspiratorial. "Andrea," he said, leaning down so only I could hear, "can I ask you something?" "Of course," I said, though my voice came out more uncertain than I intended. "Bethany told me a little about your business. She said, you specialize in helping small companies optimize their investments. Is that right?" I nodded. "Yes, that is one of the things I do," Julian smiled. And there was genuine excitement in his eyes. "I have been looking for someone like you. I own a commercial real estate development company, and we have been struggling with how to structure our investment portfolio. Our current financial advisor is not cutting it. Would you be interested in talking about it?" I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. "You want to hire me? Maybe." He said, "I would need to know more about your services first. But yeah, I think we could benefit from your expertise. And Bethany speaks very highly of you." The words landed with unexpected force. "Bethany speaks very highly of you?" After 11 years of silence, after all the hurt and distance between us, she had recommended me to her new husband. I did not know what to make of it. Was this her way of apologizing, of trying to bridge the gap between us? Or was it just business? "I would be happy to talk," I said, keeping my voice professional. "You can reach me through my company website. I will send you my contact information." "Perfect," Julian said. He pulled out his phone and handed it to me so I could type in my details. When I handed it back, he grinned. "I am looking forward to working with you, Andrea. I have a good feeling about this." As he walked away, I sat back in my chair, my mind racing. This was not what I had expected. I had come to the wedding prepared to face rejection and disdain. I had armed myself with years of success and accomplishment, ready to prove that I was worthy of respect. But instead of fighting for validation, it was being offered to me. Not as a gift, but as an opportunity, a genuine one. The rest of the evening passed in a strange haze. I danced a few more times, talked with guests I barely knew, and watched as Bethany and Julian moved through the room, greeting everyone with warmth and gratitude. My mother approached me once, looking relieved that I had stayed. "I am so glad you came," she said, squeezing my arm. "It means a lot to Bethany." I nodded, but did not say much. I was still processing everything that had happened. The confrontation with Victoria, the conversation with Julian, the realization that maybe, just maybe, things were more complicated than I had allowed myself to believe. As the night wore on, guests began to leave. The dance floor emptied, and the staff started clearing tables. I gathered my things, preparing to slip out quietly. But before I could leave, Bethany found me near the exit. She looked exhausted but happy, her hair slightly mused from dancing. "Andrea," she said, her voice soft. "Thank you for coming. I know it was not easy." I met her eyes, searching for sincerity. "It was not," I admitted, "but I am glad I did." She hesitated, then reached out and took my hand. "I owe you an apology for that night, for not standing up for you. I was young and stupid, and I let other people dictate how I treated you. I have regretted it for years." The apology hung in the air between us, fragile and unexpected. Part of me wanted to accept it immediately, to let go of the resentment I had carried for so long. But another part of me remembered the pain of that night, the way she had turned her back on me when I needed her most. "Why now?" I asked. "Why apologize after all this time?" Bethany looked down at our joined hands. "Because I grew up, because my first marriage fell apart, and I learned what it felt like to be judged and dismissed by people who were supposed to care about me. Trevor was not a good person, Andrea. I did not see it at first, but I should have. And the way he treated you that night should have been a warning sign." I felt a jolt of vindication at her words, but also sadness. She had suffered too, in her own way. "What happened between you two?" I asked. "A lot of things," she said. "But mostly I realized he was controlling and cruel. He isolated me from people who cared about me. He made me feel small, and when I finally left him, I understood what I had done to you. I had let someone treat you the same way he was treating me, and I did nothing to stop it." Her voice broke slightly, and I saw tears welling in her eyes. "I do not expect you to forgive me right away," she continued, "but I want you to know that I am sorry, and I want to try to make things right if you will let me." I looked at my sister, really looked at her, and saw someone who was trying, someone who had made mistakes and was owning up to them. It did not erase the past. It did not undo the pain of that night 11 years ago, but it was something, a starting point. "I appreciate the apology," I said carefully, "but it is going to take time. I have built a life without you, without any of them, and I am not sure how to fit you back into it." Bethany nodded, wiping at her eyes. "I understand. I just wanted you to know that the door is open, whenever you are ready." Before I could respond, Julian appeared beside her, slipping an arm around her waist. "Everything okay?" he asked, looking between us with concern. "Yes," Bethany said, smiling up at him. "Everything is fine." Julian turned to me, and there was something knowing in his expression. "You know her?" he asked, gesturing toward Victoria, who was standing across the room talking with a group of guests. I followed his gaze and saw Victoria laughing, completely unaware of our conversation. "More than you think," I said quietly. Julian's smile widened. "Good, because I have a feeling she is going to be very surprised when I tell her who I am hiring as my new financial consultant." The pieces clicked into place, and I felt a rush of satisfaction. Julian knew about that night. Bethany had told him what had happened, and he had decided to offer me the job, not just because I was qualified, but because he wanted to prove a point. He wanted to show Victoria and everyone else who had dismissed me that I was valuable, that I mattered. "I look forward to working with you," I said, shaking his hand. As I left the reception and made my way to my car, I felt lighter than I had in years. The weight of that night at the Sterling Oak had not disappeared entirely, but it had shifted. It was no longer a burden I carried alone. Bethany had acknowledged what had happened. Julian had offered me an opportunity, and I had proven to myself that I was strong enough to face the people who had hurt me without falling apart. The drive home was quiet, the city lights blinking past my windows as I navigated the familiar streets of Phoenix. I thought about that 18-year-old girl who had left the restaurant crying, convinced that she was not good enough. I wished I could go back and tell her what I knew now, that the people who rejected her did not define her worth, that she would build something incredible out of that pain, that she would survive and thrive in ways she could not yet imagine. But I could not go back. All I could do was move forward, carrying the lessons I had learned and the scars I had earned. And as I pulled into my parking space and turned off the engine, I realized that was enough. I had faced my past. I had confronted the people who had hurt me. And I had come out the other side stronger for it. The next morning, I woke up to an email from Julian. It was brief and professional, outlining a time for us to meet and discuss his company's financial needs. I responded quickly, confirming the meeting and attaching my standard client intake form. As I hit send, I felt a surge of satisfaction. This was happening. I was going to work with my sister's husband, and in doing so, I was going to prove once and for all that the girl they had dismissed was gone. Over the next few weeks, I met with Julian several times. His company was larger than I had expected, with multiple projects in various stages of development. The financial side was a mess, poorly organized and lacking any coherent strategy. I dug into the numbers, analyzing cash flow and investment returns, and began putting together a comprehensive plan to streamline their operations. Julian was an excellent client. He asked intelligent questions and trusted my expertise. He also talked openly about the wedding, about how happy he was to have married Bethany, and about how much he admired what I had built for myself. "She talks about you all the time now," he said during one of our meetings. "She feels terrible about what happened between you two." "She apologized," I said. That meant a lot. "Good," Julian said, "because she means it. And honestly, I am glad you are in our lives now. Bethany needs family she can count on." The word struck me more than I expected. Family. It was a complicated word full of history and pain. But it was also a word that meant connection, belonging. And maybe, just maybe, I was ready to let it mean something again. Then about a month after the wedding, Julian called me with news. "I just got off the phone with Victoria," he said, and I could hear the amusement in his voice. "She was asking about my new financial consultant. When I told her it was you, she went silent for about 30 seconds. I smiled, imagining Victoria's face when she realized what had happened. "What did she say?" "Not much," Julian admitted. "She tried to play it off like it was no big deal, but I could tell she was rattled. I think it finally clicked for her that you are not the person she remembers." "Good," I said, and I meant it. The real turning point came 2 months after the wedding. Julian's company was preparing to present their restructured investment portfolio to a group of potential investors, and he asked me to join him for the meeting. It was being held at an upscale conference center in Phoenix, and when I arrived, I was surprised to see how many people were in attendance. Businessmen and women in expensive suits filled the room, all of them eager to hear about the opportunities Julian's company was offering. What I did not expect was to see Victoria sitting in the front row. She was with her husband, both of them dressed impeccably and looking every bit the successful couple. When our eyes met, I saw recognition flash across her face, followed quickly by confusion. What was I doing here? Why was I walking to the front of the room with Julian? Julian began the presentation by introducing himself and his company, then turned to me. "I would like you to meet Andrea, my financial consultant. She has been instrumental in restructuring our investment strategy, and I am confident that her work will deliver significant returns for everyone involved." I stepped forward and began my portion of the presentation. I had done this dozens of times before, but never with Victoria watching. I could feel her eyes on me as I walked through the numbers, explaining the changes we had made and the projected outcomes. I spoke clearly and confidently, my years of experience evident in every word. When I finished, the room erupted in applause. Several people approached me afterward to ask questions, and I answered each one with the same professionalism I brought to every client interaction. But the best part came when Victoria finally made her way over, her husband trailing behind her. "Andrea," she said, her smile strained, "that was very impressive." "Thank you," I said, meeting her eyes without flinching. "I had no idea you were working with Julian," she continued. "Bethany never mentioned it." "Did she not?" I said lightly. "Well, it has been a busy few months." Victoria's husband extended his hand, introducing himself as Gregory. He seemed genuinely interested in my work, asking thoughtful questions about my approach to portfolio management. As we talked, I noticed Victoria growing increasingly uncomfortable. She was used to being the center of attention, the successful one with the prestigious career and the perfect life. Seeing me in this position, respected and valued, was clearly unsettling for her. Before she could say anything else, Julian appeared at my side. "Andrea, there are some people I want you to meet," he said, placing a hand on my shoulder. "Excuse us." He led me away, leaving Victoria standing there with her strained smile. As we walked, Julian leaned in and whispered, "That was perfect." "Did you see her face?" "I did," I said, unable to suppress my own smile. "She did not expect this," he said. "None of them did. And I think that is exactly what you needed." He was right. For 11 years, I had carried the weight of that night at the Sterling Oak, wondering if I would ever feel whole again. But standing in that conference room, watching Victoria struggle to reconcile the person she remembered with the person I had become, I felt something shift inside me. I was not looking for her approval anymore. I did not need her validation or her acknowledgement. I had built something real, and it existed independently of her opinion. The meeting ended with several investors committing to fund Julian's projects. It was a massive success. And as we left the conference center, Julian was practically glowing. "You did amazing work, Andrea," he said. "I could not have done this without you." "You give me too much credit," I said, though his words warmed me. "No," he insisted, "I do not. You are exactly as talented as I thought you would be, and I am grateful that Bethany reconnected us." Over the next few months, my relationship with Bethany slowly began to heal. We started having coffee together once a week, tentatively rebuilding the connection we had lost. It was not easy. There were moments when old resentments surfaced, when I wanted to remind her of all the years she had been silent. But I forced myself to focus on the present, on the effort she was making to bridge the gap between us. She told me more about her marriage to Trevor, about the ways he had controlled and manipulated her. She admitted that she had been blind to his cruelty, too focused on maintaining the appearance of a perfect life. When she finally left him, she had lost friends and family who sided with him, who believed his version of events. It had been devastating, but it had also taught her who truly mattered. "I do not expect you to forgive me completely," she said during one of our conversations. "But I hope we can move forward. I want you in my life, Andrea. Not because I need something from you, but because you are my sister." I looked at her across the table at the vulnerability in her eyes and felt the last of my anger begin to dissolve. "I want that too," I said. "But we have to be honest with each other. No more pretending things are fine when they are not." "Deal," she said, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. The final piece of my revenge came unexpectedly during a family gathering that Bethany organized for Thanksgiving. It was the first time I had agreed to attend a family event in 11 years, and I was nervous about seeing everyone again. But Bethany had insisted, promising that it would be different this time, that she would make sure I felt welcome. The dinner was held at Bethany and Julian's house, a beautiful property in Scottsdale with a sprawling backyard and a view of the desert. When I arrived, I was greeted warmly by Julian, who introduced me to several guests I did not know. My mother was there, looking older, but genuinely happy to see me. My stepfather shook my hand and told me he had heard about my success. And then inevitably, Victoria arrived. She walked in with Gregory, carrying a bottle of expensive wine and wearing an expression of forced cheer. When she saw me standing in the living room talking with Julian and Bethany, her smile faltered for just a second before she recovered. "Andrea," she said, her voice overly bright. "What a surprise." "Is it?" I said calmly. "Bethany invited me." Victoria glanced at Bethany, who nodded. "Of course I did," Bethany said. "Andrea is family." The words landed with unmistakable weight. Victoria's smile tightened, but she said nothing. Instead, she turned to greet other guests, avoiding me for the rest of the evening. I did not mind. I was not here for her. I was here for myself and for Bethany, and for the fragile new beginning we were trying to build. Dinner was a lively affair with too much food and too much laughter. Julian gave a toast, thanking everyone for coming, and specifically mentioning how grateful he was to have me as part of his team. My mother teared up, clearly moved by the gesture. Even my stepfather raised his glass in my direction, acknowledging my success in a way he never had before. But the moment I had been waiting for came later after the meal was finished and people were mingling over coffee and dessert. Victoria cornered me in the kitchen, her expression tight with barely concealed frustration. "You must be very proud of yourself," she said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "I am," I said simply. "You have really made something of yourself, have you not? Built a nice little business, impressed everyone with your success. Is there something you want to say, Victoria?" She leaned in slightly, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "I want to know what your angle is. Why are you suddenly back in Bethy's life?" Are you trying to take advantage of her? Of Julian? The accusation was so absurd that I almost laughed. Take advantage of them? Victoria, I am their financial consultant. I work for them. They hired me because I am good at what I do, not because I manipulated them into it. You expect me to believe that? She hissed. You disappeared for 11 years, and now you show up at Bethy's wedding and suddenly you are best friends again. It is suspicious. I felt my patience snap. For years, I had let Victoria's words cut into me, had allowed her cruelty to define how I saw myself. But I was done being her victim. You know what, Victoria? I do not care what you believe. I do not care if you think I have an angle, or if you think I am using Bethany, because the truth is, you have never mattered to me. Not really. You were just someone who said cruel things at a vulnerable moment in my life. But I moved past it. I built a career and a life that I am proud of, and nothing you say now can take that away from me. Her face flushed with anger. You think you are so much better than me, do you not? No, I said honestly. I just think I am better than the person you tried to convince me I was. Before she could respond, Julian entered the kitchen, sensing the tension. Everything okay in here? He asked, looking between us. Everything is fine, I said, turning away from Victoria. I was just getting some air. I walked out onto the back patio, letting the cool night air calm my racing heart. The confrontation had been inevitable, but it was also cathartic. I had finally said the things I needed to say, and it felt like closing a chapter I had been stuck in for far too long. Julian joined me a few minutes later, leaning against the railing beside me. Victoria giving you trouble? She tried, I said. But it does not matter anymore. He nodded, looking out at the desert landscape. You know, Bethany told me what happened that night at the Sterling Oak. She was ashamed of it for years. She apologized. I said that helped. Good. Julian said, because you deserve better than the way they treated you. And I wanted you to know that in this family, you are valued. Not because of what you can do for us, but because of who you are. His words touched something deep inside me, and I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. Thank you, I said quietly. We stood there in companionable silence for a while, watching the stars appear in the darkening sky. Eventually, Bethany came out to join us, slipping her arm through mine. Are you okay? She asked. I am, I said, and I meant it. The weeks following Thanksgiving brought a sense of closure I had not expected. Victoria stopped attending family gatherings, and while I heard through my mother that she was unhappy about my presence, I did not let it bother me. She had made her choice to distance herself, and I was content to let her go. My relationship with Bethany continued to strengthen. We talked more openly than we ever had before about our childhoods, our regrets, and our hopes for the future. She introduced me to her friends, and I found myself slowly building a social circle that extended beyond my work colleagues. It was strange and wonderful to feel like I belonged somewhere again. Julian's company thrived under the new financial strategy we had implemented. Within 6 months, they had secured funding for 3 major projects, and my reputation in the Phoenix business community grew. I hired additional staff to handle the influx of new clients, and my company expanded into a larger office space. I was busier than I had ever been, but I was also happier. One evening about 8 months after the wedding, Bethany invited me over for dinner. It was just the 3 of us, a quiet meal without the pressure of extended family or business obligations. As we sat around their dining table eating pasta and drinking wine, I felt a profound sense of peace. I have been thinking, Bethany said, setting down her fork, about that night, about what Victoria said to you. You do not have to talk about it, I said quickly. No, I do, she insisted, because I want you to know that I see you now. I see what you have accomplished, and I am so proud of you. But more than that, I see the person you always were, smart and strong and resilient. I am sorry it took me so long to recognize that. Julian reached across the table and squeezed her hand, then turned to me. We both are, he said. You deserved better than the way you were treated, and while we cannot change the past, we want to make sure the future is different. I felt tears welling up, and I did not try to stop them. Thank you, I said, my voice thick with emotion. Both of you. We spent the rest of the evening talking and laughing, reminiscing about happier memories and making plans for the future. When I finally left to go home, I felt lighter than I had in years. The weight of that night at the Sterling Oak had not disappeared entirely, but it no longer defined me. I had faced my past, confronted the people who had hurt me, and come out the other side stronger. As I drove through the quiet streets of Phoenix, I thought about the 18-year-old girl who had left that restaurant crying. I thought about how small and worthless she had felt, and how certain she had been that she would never measure up. And I wished I could go back and tell her the truth, that she was enough, that she would build something incredible, that the people who rejected her would one day look at her with respect and admiration. But I could not go back. All I could do was move forward, carrying the lessons I had learned and the strength I had earned. And as I pulled into my parking space and turned off the engine, I realized that was exactly what I had done. The revenge I had sought was not dramatic or explosive. It was not about humiliating Victoria or making her suffer. It was about proving to myself that I was worthy of respect, that I could build a life of value and meaning despite the cruelty I had endured. It was about walking into a room full of people who had dismissed me and showing them through my actions and my success that they had been wrong. In the months that followed, Victoria's life began to unravel in ways I had not anticipated. Her husband, Gregory, filed for divorce after discovering she had been hiding significant debts from a failed business venture. The scandal rippled through their social circle, and many of the friends who had once admired her began to distance themselves. Her career stalled, and she was forced to sell her house and move into a smaller apartment on the outskirts of Phoenix. I heard about it through my mother, who seemed torn between sympathy and a sense of justice. I felt neither. Victoria's downfall was not my doing, and I took no pleasure in her suffering. But I also did not feel sorry for her. She had built her life on cruelty and superficiality, and when those foundations crumbled, she had nothing left to stand on. As for me, I continued to build my company, expand my client base, and nurture the relationships that mattered. Bethany and I grew closer with each passing month, and Julian became not just a client, but a friend. I reconnected with my mother in a way I had not thought possible, and while our relationship would never be perfect, it was better than it had been. Looking back on that night 11 years ago, I realized that Victoria's words had been a gift in disguise. They had hurt me deeply, but they had also ignited a fire inside me that refused to be extinguished. I had spent 11 years proving that I was more than the labels she had tried to place on me. And in doing so, I had discovered a strength I never knew I possessed. The journey had been long and painful, but it had also been worth it. Because in the end, the best revenge was not about making others suffer. It was about building a life so full and meaningful that the opinions of small-minded people no longer mattered. And that was exactly what I had done.